I wanted to scale microfinance and help more people. That's how I know we're doing something right. The thing with impact investing is as long as you are clear what your goal is from the beginning.
You're being so entrepreneurial and innovative. Is that what you left university thinking you were going to do?
I now know where I am on that sort of continuum, where is that I'm love making things and designing new systems and solving problems.
The way Elizabeth described an impact measurement that was actually meaningful. Welcome back to the CEO Advantage podcast, and I'm thrilled to be back here with Millie. And we've got an incredible guest this morning, Millie. I'm so excited. I know you are too. Why don't you start with the introductions today?
I am so excited, Paul, about welcoming Elizabeth Funk to the CEO Advantage podcast. A little bit of a side note, I was living with Elizabeth almost 10 years ago in San Francisco when I was running my startup. Yeah. And Elizabeth just became the most incredible mentor, friend and person in my life during that time. So it's going to be quite I think a bit emotional to kind of start with that. Yeah, Elizabeth means a lot to me and she is one of the most incredible humans and leaders. So to tell you a little bit more about Elizabeth, I'm just going to read out a little bit about your bio, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Funk is the founder and CEO of Dignity Moves, an innovative nonprofit committed to ending unsheltered homelessness through disruptive and scalable solutions. Elizabeth started her career as a product manager at Microsoft for the first version of Word for Windows and on the founding team of Microsoft Office. As one of the earliest employees at Yahoo, she helped shape the early consumer internet with services such as Yahoo Finance, Search, Auctions, Greetings, Travel, and others. And most notably, Elizabeth was behind the creation of Yahoo Shopping, a forerunner for the booming sector now known as e-commerce. And she later served as president and CEO of CML Global Capital, a global public company with operations in Brazil, Hong Kong, Canada, and the US. And Elizabeth was one of the early pioneers in impact investing. She founded the Dignity Fund in 2004 and one of the first for-profit funds mobilizing investment capital for the microfinance industry. Wow, wow, wow. There is so much more to that bio. Incredible. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Welcome, Elizabeth. What an incredible bio. And I can't wait to explore all of those parts. But the first question we ask everybody on our podcast is, what was the first job you had that you got paid for?
Well, Microsoft, I think. I worked for my cousin for summer, but I'm pretty sure I wasn't paid. We won't count that one. I was coming out of Stanford undergrad, and I was an economics and international relations major, which had nothing to do with technology, but Microsoft was smart enough to be hiring non-technical people to do product design, knowing that techies tend to design for techies and it makes sense to them, but not to the rest of us.
Yeah.
So it was right when, as you mentioned, when the consumer version of Word and Excel was coming out. What you see is what you get. Colors and bold and all that was revolutionary. And so designing products that real people would use rather than black screen and white text.
Wow. So the reason we ask about first jobs, of course, is for some of our non-CEO listeners or some of our perhaps aspiring CEO listeners to sort of go, the key to being really successful in your career is start it. Wherever you start, it doesn't really matter. It's how you develop and how you apply yourself. So we sort of bookend our conversations because we know we're going to soar, particularly with you, to a level we probably will soar to very rarely. Mm-hmm. Please, if you can, share with us for our listeners those early stages of when you're at Microsoft. There's so much that we take for granted now that you were part of seeing evolve, and then seeing the internet sort of then revolutionize it again. So can you just give us a flavour of some of those stories?
And I think you're right, especially when you're new in your career, one of the biggest gifts is to not know how it's always been done. Like, well, okay, that doesn't make sense to me. It's not deeply ingrained. And probably the most fun stories are Yahoo, when we really were just making it up. We had no idea how people were going to use the internet. And we guessed wrong on some things. One of our early guesses was that people were going to be too overwhelmed by the breadth of the internet, and they were going to want local confined versions. So there was Yahoo LA, Yahoo New York, Yahoo Chicago. And we learned quickly that people actually define community not by their zip code, but by a shared love of Beanie Babies. They just hadn't had that ability before. And now with the internet, they could. And so that was one of my first responsibilities at Yahoo, was the Yahoo communities, local communities. And we scratched that. But what we did is we watched user patterns. And the thing that was the most common was the classified ads. Well, that became, the dating services that we have today. But, one of the fun ones is a guy, an older guy who came in and wanted to have a meeting. And I was sort of the partnership person. So, I was the one who had to take all the inbound requests. And we sat down in our conference room, which was under a Coca-Cola machine. It was a little round table. He said, did you know that all the data about flights, where they're going to and where they're coming from, it's actually public data? So I didn't know that. He said, why would you write a web page where people could search from and to, and it would show them what the prices were? And then he said, my daughter is at home. She's a new mother. So she's working from home. She could print the tickets. We'd put your logo on it, and we would share our $30 travel agent fee with you. I remember looking at him going, okay. So that was how Yahoo Travel started. And we really didn't think much of it. Our quarterly revenue share that year was, I think he sent me a $150 check. That's how many tickets we sold. And then you fast forward a year later, and this little company called Travelocity came in and they said, we can only get our money from our venture capitalists on the condition that we buy out Yahoo's travel partnership. And I remember thinking about it going, I don't think I ever signed a deal with that guy. We shook hands. So, it really was, some of it was trial and error. And I guess my biggest one was the shopping. And I said to the guys, I said, wouldn't it be cool if you could shop online? They're like, no. It was like, no, who wants to shop? And internet's for fun stuff like stock quotes and sports scores and pornography. Shopping for shoes is a little bit like pornography for women. We just enjoy looking. We don't even have to buy. We just enjoy the process. And they just couldn't get their heads around it. Really. So I went out and I bought HTML for Dummies at the bookstore, and I wrote it myself. That was not a good idea. The Jerry Yang came into my office the next day yelling. He said, you don't even know when it's on a browser, it looks upside down. And your body's like, how could you do this? And, but I did. And there were about 4 companies selling online at that point. Amazon was selling books. CD Now was selling CDs. Macy's was selling one SKU of black pantyhose that was supersized. And that was the extent of the online shopping.
Wow.
But I made a little directory of it, and I turned out to be right. Just going to say. But that wasn't any major wisdom. I think that the beauty of all of those times was, just try. Throw it out and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And on contrary to software, where if you have an idea, it takes 18 months to build it in, or did back then, to build it into the version and then send out the CDs. With the internet, we could put it up and sleep under my desk, which I did at least 3 nights a week, and wake up in the night and see how many people had used it and which part of it they used and the real-time feedback. So just, not overthinking it. Try and see what works.
Yeah. And I love that, you really you had this idea and you're like, I'm going to learn HTML. I'm going to get this book and I'm going to try to do it myself. And then you can try and make it better to the rest of the Yahoo team if you want, if it works. Like, I just love that attitude, that go-do of you. That's just awesome. Yeah.
When you left university, is what you ended up doing, getting HTML for Dummies and being so entrepreneurial and innovative, is that what you left university thinking you were going to do?
I mean, when I left university, I had no idea what I was going to do. I think, and this has been a little bit of a theme about my career path, which is that I don't necessarily care what it is that I'm working on, but there's a characteristic of a type of job. And I think I give a lot of career advice to unsolicited, of course, but having the self-awareness of where you fit on a spectrum of, there are some people who are the idea people. And by the way, those people are crazy. And crazy is a compliment, right? Like crazy ideas. And then there are the people who can follow along behind them. They're throwing 100 things over their shoulder and you see the one and say, now that one, I know how to do. And so that person is the one who can recognize a good idea and institutionalize it and build the team around it. And then there's somebody who knows how to grow, is a business mind and knows scale. And then there's somebody who knows how to operate and stabilize. And, knowing where you are on that spectrum is important. But man, being aware where you aren't. And the biggest mistake is those crazy people think they can run a company. No, they can't, and they shouldn't. It's not the best use of their skills, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of know where I am, which is I'm in sort of that second and third stage where I'm not the idea person, but I can see one and go, oh, that is itching. That one is itching me. I've got to do it. And set it up. And then when it gets, stable and other people can do it, it's not kind of my unique value to the world and it's time to move on. And it's one of the reasons why you see a career that's been a zigzag, because I'm not the person who's going to stay in it for a while. It is kind of like, I affectionately call it ADD, which it is, but it's also, some of the advice I give to a lot of, people starting their career is that it came from Microsoft, from Ballmer gave this advice, to the young people at Microsoft, said, you should not stay in a job more than 2 years. The first few months, you're learning. For the next 12 months, you're sailing and you're adding a lot of value. But once you get to the point where you've thought of all your ideas and you know what you're doing, there's diminishing returns for you in terms of learning and diminishing returns of new thinking into the project. And so if you want to do international sales for 2 years, then go do product design, then go do logistics. And as a career path, having an understanding of all those different functions as you're building your way up towards CEO is really valuable advice. And I think the biggest mistake is somebody says, well, I'm a fill in the blank salesperson.
Yeah.
Man, you're selling yourself short.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, especially at the start. There's so many. One of the things, similarly, unsolicited advice that I give young people is just do something, and just say yes. Because you're in a position where if you don't have a mortgage, you don't have all these commitments, just say yes to stuff and you'll learn as much from what you don't like as you will like, but just say yes to everything. When do you think, though, Elizabeth, when do you think the 2-year window needs to slow down and become a longer, more stable approach? When do you think that emerges?
Yeah. And let me caveat it because I said it a little bit exaggerated to make a point. He didn't mean go to different companies. It's right within Microsoft, right? In that case, to learn all the different functions. And I think the functions are transferable. So if you're developing your sales skills, that is something that is going to, you can do sales for one company, but once you've learned all those customers, made all the pitches, you've got the relationships that like you, there are diminishing returns to it being you. But for that person to then be in product design or marketing with the same company. And so I don't mean just be completely starting over every time, but especially, this next generation is going to live a long time, right? I mean, we may have a 150-year life expectancy. It's important. I mean, even a law degree doesn't mean you're going to be a lawyer for the rest of your life. Don't say, I'm going to be a lawyer. Those legal skills and that logic is equally applicable elsewhere. And so thinking of it as a portfolio of skills and expertise rather than the specific career.
Did you have to move around a lot throughout your career, or were you able to stay in California throughout your career? Tell us about how much you had to move around and those sort of things.
Sure. Well, Microsoft was in Seattle. Yeah. So my first job out of Stanford, I went up to the rain and the cold and the drizzle. And because I was the low person on the totem pole, I had the thankless job of being the one who traveled and gave the in-person presentations. We used to do these 3-hour-long, fill an auditorium with 200 people and do demos. This was back before people could log on and see product. And so we would pitch the products and demo them. And then I was 3-hour presentations in front of 2,000 people 3 times a week. Yeah. Talk about learning a skill of public speaking. But I was constantly traveling and I loved it at that stage of my life. Then I went to business school at Harvard. So I got to experience what real cold is.
Yeah, that's right.
And I thought Seattle had it. And so then I came back to California, and I've had a unique ability to stay here, even though, because my work has been primarily international. And so at Yahoo, I was here physically, and that was for 4 years. But when I left Yahoo, I'm sure we'll talk about it, my work has all been global. And so San Francisco is as good as any place to kind of hunker down. And so I'm kind of one of the only people when the pandemic hit and everybody was working from home, I didn't notice the difference other than my kids were around. Because that's kind of how I've always worked. And when my daughter was first born, we moved to Paris for 2 years. Like, why not? Different time zone, but so I've been able to move around as I choose, but also stay primarily Bay Area.
Elizabeth, how old were you when you started working at Yahoo?
Oh, I'd have to do the math. So early 30s.
Early 30s. Okay. Yeah. So you really, and that was and how many years did you have at Microsoft?
So yeah, we could do. So I was 4 years at Microsoft.
4 years Microsoft. Yeah.
Before I went back to business school, which is kind of what the standard, they always suggest, 4 years. I actually wasn't quite ready to go, but I broke up with a boyfriend and was one of those tearful nights that I'm like, I'm getting out of here. It's time to go to business school. And actually, when I made that decision, all of the application deadlines had passed except Harvard's. So I threw in an application to Harvard in about 8 days and just, why not? So I got in. I never applied anywhere else. And so let's see. So I was in Microsoft for 4 years, 2 years at HBS, and then Yahoo for about 4.5 years. The Yahoo story is kind of interesting. When I was job hunting, I came back to the Bay Area. I thought I wanted to be a venture capitalist. And I was here for some VC interviews. And a friend of mine said, you should come meet this crazy company called Yahoo with an exclamation point. And so I went and I met with them, and they were literally like 4 guys, in one room with cubicles, no sign on the door. And we hit it off, and they said, okay, you're hired. You got to start tomorrow. I said, no. See, it's my second year of business school. It's only October, and I don't graduate till June. And they looked at me like, what does that have to do with anything? So I did 3 nights here, 4 nights there, red eyes back and forth for the second year of business school. Loved every minute of it. Didn't have an apartment, literally slept under my desk, not kidding. I was there. We had actually gone public by the time I graduated. By the time I graduated from HBS, we'd already IPO'd.
Wow. So you're one of the first female part of the founding team of Yahoo. One of the first females, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Incredible.
I wasn't founding team. There were Jerry and Dave, and then they had got their first round of funding from Sequoia, Mike Moritz, $10 million, and they were hiring in the first wave. So I was in the first wave of employees. Yeah. Don't get founder status, but close.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, for someone starting out their career, there was a little snippet there that is worth capturing. And that is, for those who don't know the States well, for international people, you getting up and getting on a red eye and going backwards and forwards. We're talking, if you're in Australia, about getting up, flying from Melbourne to Perth and Perth back to Melbourne. This is 5 hours, isn't it? This is not a little, it wasn't a puddle jump you were doing.
I'm a million miler, frequent flyer now.
Started back then.
Incredible. So it's that you were saying yes to things, even if yes seemed like there were lots of ways you could say no and justify no, but you said yes anyway.
Well, I was deciding between Yahoo and investment banking at that point.
What a good choice you made.
Couldn't have been more different. And I'll never forget a guy named Shelby Bonney. I was out here interviewing, having my interviews, and we were supposed to have a 30-minute coffee, get to know you, and we talked for 3.5 hours. And he's like, let me explain to you what investment banking is. Let me show you the prospectuses that you write, and and so it took some courage. My mother, grew up in Kansas City in the Midwest, very traditional family, and I think she was teary when I told her that I was turning down investment banking jobs for a company that had an exclamation point at the end of this name. She was stuck on that. And she thought it was Yoo-hoo, the chocolate drink. And my starting salary was $60,000, which was the starting salary I had when I got out of college. Coincidentally, exactly the same. And why have you worked for all this time? And why have I paid for business school? And what are you doing? But it felt right. It just, and there was nothing. I didn't have children at the time. there was really no downside. And the traditional careers have just never appealed to me. And now I understand more than ever why.
Why did those traditional? Are you glad you didn't get into banking?
I am. It would have been such a bad fit for me. And the problem is I would have morphed. I would have fit, and I would have, embraced it. But I now know where I am on that sort of continuum, where is that I'm love making things and designing new systems and solving problems and pulling together the energy and enthusiasm for it and setting it on its path. Investment bankers are not in charge of anything creative, right? They are, hired to do an IPO or whatever. And obviously I've been generating, those investment bankers out there are probably, arguing with me in their heads. But, so it's a personality fit that it took a lot of self-awareness. And it's also why I left Yahoo. I'll never forget when we were doing this annual business review that each business unit had half a day to present what their headcount numbers were and their financial projections and their resources. And I was overseeing 6 or 7 business units. So I'd had several days in a row of this. I walked out one night and I looked at Jerry and I said, I'm not quitting today, but I can promise you this will be my last annual business review. I don't do this. And knowing that and knowing that's not what I was good at and admitting it. And so we actually talked about a really cool potential, which was what he called off-balance sheet R&D, because he was aware that Yahoo had gotten to the point where it now, I couldn't just make Yahoo shopping and throw it out there without talking to anybody. There were committees for that and there were teams. And so, that innovative freeness is something that companies lose quickly because each business unit has their responsibilities. And so he said, why don't we just you go create something that we want and you figure out if it can work and then we'll buy it. Right. And let's just go build these things off balance sheet. And I didn't end up doing that because I got hooked on what I ended up doing next, which we'll talk about. But that preserving that true innovation as companies scale is one of the biggest pitfalls and challenges, I think.
Yeah. Stanford do some really good work around that, starting with the I can't remember the author, but the innovator's dilemma, and all the experiments around whether you should do off balance sheet or whether it should be done. And then you've got Charles O'Reilly and Mike Tushman who do talk about the ambidextrous challenge of having to stay the same but do different. And there's lots of case studies of organizations, the famous blockbuster Netflix story. But I mean, in California, there's so many of those examples and Stanford does that so well to look at that innovators challenge and the ambidextrous challenge. And how many times going off balance sheet failed because the inertia of the big business was able to justify it out of existence often.
Right. Well, and it's also about thinking about the challenge differently. Let me give you one example, which is greeting cards, online greeting cards. So AOL bought Blue Mountain Cards or something one day for $53 million. And Jerry came into my office and he's like, we got to get greeting cards. Go buy Hallmark. Find somebody you can buy. And so I was working on literally where are there greeting card companies out there? Because we need to have the feature they have. And I got a call from a student who was looking for a summer internship from Harvard Business School in the alumni directory. And I almost didn't take his call. I said, I don't have time to talk to you. I got to buy a greeting card company by the end of the day. And he said, well, just talk to me for a minute. How are you going about that? And we started talking and he said, well, what is greeting cards? Greeting cards are just art. And one thing led to another, and he got the job for the summer, and his job was go find independent artists that would love to give their art in exchange for a link to their website. And we've got our mail system, and let's just build it on the backs of independent creative artists that are going to be way cooler than what Hallmark has, right? And we built greeting cards for summer intern minimum wage.
Yeah.
Not 53 million.
Yeah.
Because we just thought about it differently. And I can't say I came up with a brilliant idea. Another great example of me recognizing one from somebody else and saying, let's go. I can help you figure out where to find artists and what the return ought to be and whatever. But I don't have to come up with the idea, but being able to see how you can make it real.
Can I ask one more question before we move to the next stage? And that is that intersection of the investment banking, the innovative company that's been successful enough to now the bankers are saying you should list and have a liquidity event and have this injection of capital and all of these fabulous things. And there are such, it's almost within the entrepreneurship community, this it's almost this mythical journey of we got some VC and then we listed. That's great if you're a founder and you're having an exit, or you're an investor and you get an exit. But for the people who've grown up in the company and love it and have done the innovation and done the entrepreneurship, the listing and the VC entry does change everything, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, no, venture capitalists, not so much. Depends on who it is.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, the VCs were really valuable in pushing, quite frankly, to think bigger and think more strategically. But once you're listed, you don't have the luxury to be taking as many risks. And it, there's a point to that scale. There's a value to it, but it's a very conscious decision and one to not take lightly.
Mm. It's a really it enters a really interesting space, and I know even in the evolution of in not-for-profit space, where there are similar kinds of cycles where you go from scrambling and it's what I referred to in the early stages of my SYC journey of going earnestly broke all the time, to then sort of getting to a scale. And then it's interesting, we'll get into impact investing and your incredible early work in that space, but how the whole idea of impact investing, social impact bonds, and all created this quite remarkable distraction from, on one hand, pushing purpose, but then on the other hand, completely distracting resource from purpose for, and it's very reminiscent of an innovative company listing going towards social impact investing. But I'm keen to sort of get into that. So tell us, you got to the end of your Yahoo journey, and what next?
Well, first of all, I will give you a preview, which is I can't believe that you just pulled out that subtlety. That is something that a lot of people don't understand, and I will elaborate on it. That was very, very brilliant. So I left Yahoo thinking I was going to go back to a small startup, and I was looking around, but I was trying to be kind of methodical about it, which in retrospect, I should have laughed. Like, there's nothing methodical about my career journey. But I was thinking, like, instead of deciding what I wanted to do, I want to look at the characteristics. And I literally drew like the outlines of a box, a blank box. I want it to be international because I'd been an international relations major and I loved travel. I wanted to be able to have schedule flexibility because I was going to be having young kids. I wanted it to be sort of, here are the characteristics of the job, and what's in the box was less important. So I was going on about my little structural analysis and framework, and I had committed to myself that one portion of my time was going to be charity, as I called it, giving money and time away because I had been successful and I felt like I owed it. And I remember thinking about what causes I cared about. Well, friends were involved with the opera or, rainforests. And I remember thinking, I don't think there's anything I really care about. Like, it was really a dark moment for me when I thought, I'm not passionate. Like, huh? So then I started thinking, there's got to be something I really care about out there. I mean, of course I care about them, but there wasn't something that, and wow, that dark moment of like, who am I kind of triggered something. And a friend was going on a trip to India to visit a microfinance organization. I wasn't working. I thought I'd tag along. And in the process of that, and for those who don't know, microfinance is lending very small amounts of money to the world's poorest so that they can start businesses and build their own way out of poverty, primarily women, because extreme poverty is primarily single female households and rural. But, it's entrepreneurship. And coming from Silicon Valley and having seen the power of entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurial energy, if you could bottle it, you could sell it for $1 million a drop. I mean, it's so powerful. And so harnessing that to help people build their own way out of poverty really resonated for me. But I met this woman. She was a mother. She had 3 young children, single head of household, as is very common. And she said she had a cow. And she sold the milk every day, but it wasn't enough money that she could feed everybody. And so every night she said, I had to pick which child to look in their eyes and say, I'm sorry, honey, not tonight. She gets me choked up. And she said, so I was saving a penny a day to buy poison so that I could put us all out of our misery at the same time together. And at that point, she got introduced to this bank that lent her $400 so that she could buy a thermometer and pasteurize the milk into cheese. And cheese, of course, is so much more profitable, but there's no way she could have saved $400 in a decade. And that $400, by the time I met her, her kids were all on bicycles, biking cheese to the next village, selling. They were all in school, which is the definition of wealth in those communities, had school uniforms. I mean, she was one of the richest people in the village for $400, right? And she didn't need a handout. She didn't want a handout. And as you can imagine, I came home and I gave a gift, $10,000 gift to a microfinance organization. Sight unseen, Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank was the big brand.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, I got a phone call because you don't usually just send one of those checks in the mail. And they invited me to a conference, and then invited me to consider joining their board. And I attended a meeting as an observer. And I looked at all their paperwork. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys are profitable. Why are you nonprofit? And as I looked at it further and saw that there are real economies of scale in this business, the bigger you are and the more loans, you could afford to charge a lower interest rate. And I said, why aren't you guys getting investment capital? You could get, instead of $100 donation, you could put many more zeros behind that. And Muhammad Yunus yelled at me in front of the whole board. He said, it's unethical to make money while doing good. And then Steve Rockefeller pulled me aside of the break. He's like, don't worry about the ethics so much. It's just not possible. And you know what? Billy knows this. You don't tell me something's not possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I walked out of there going, gosh darn it, you guys, I'm fine with my ethics on this one. I can help more people faster.
In my 25 years as a CEO, one of the hardest things to find was a consulting and advisory firm where they'd actually been CEOs. I created CEO Advantage to be the advisory firm I was looking for. Go to ceoadvantage.com.au and find out how we can help you and your team be the best in the business.
Just to prove them wrong, I raised $8 million from friends and family and hired somebody who was a year behind me at HBS and in fund management because I didn't. And we started the Dignity Fund. And that was in 2001, way before the idea of impact investing had been coined. Yeah. And just to prove it. And so we lent money, debt, not equity. So there wouldn't be perverse incentives, charge higher interest rates. And we helped 12 organizations, 2.5% return or something like that, which it spanned over 2008. So some people, it was their best performing asset in the financial market crisis. But it proved a point. And I knew I wasn't going to solve world poverty, but I invited HSBC and Deutsche Bank and Citibank to be observers and watch so that then I could say, why don't you guys go do this? Yeah. Like, I don't have to be the one that's going to scale it, but let me prove the model. And today, the vast majority of money in the microfinance industry is investment capital. It had a bad swing where it became really popular and there was over indebtedness. Everybody was selling microfinance loans to anybody who walked down the street. But that's just a normal bubble and burst. But microfinance is largely attributed to having eradicated or dramatically reduced what the UN considers extreme poverty in our world. So people made profit, unapologetic. If people can get rich solving the world's problems, they will be solved. Greed is a powerful motivator. I'm not afraid and embarrassed to harness it. And philanthropy can only go so far.
Yeah, we had a prime minister in the 80s who said, always back the horse called self-interest. At least you know it's trying.
Yes. It's exactly true. And, and the thing with impact investing, which is different from ESG, the thing with impact investing is as long as you are clear what your goal is from the beginning. And so in some cases, you've got for-profit businesses that understand that greenwashing and making it look like your impact is going to, it's going to be window dressing. And you have the other end of the spectrum where you have entrepreneurs starting nonprofits that really want to do it for the good. And they realize they probably better have a business model. Otherwise, it won't be sustainable. but they're not really business minds, right? And there's everything in between. And in my case, it was, I wanted to scale microfinance and help more people. And if my investors got a return as a byproduct, I want to use the sharpest tool in the drawer. And if that sharp tool makes sawdust called profit, I don't care.
Yeah.
But that was the way to think about it. And as long as you're aligned, and as I moved on in my impact investing journey, I've got a hot chili pepper company in Ecuador that's helping small farmers grow hot chilies. And it was one of these moments where I said, if we're here for impact, we want to pay as much as we can for those chilies. If we're here for profit, I want to pay as little as I can for those chilies. What I'm not going to do is debate it in the boardroom when we have a board meeting.
Yep. Yeah. So by 2008, you would have seen you're way ahead of the curve in impact investing thinking. I'd love to hear some of your possible frustrations with where impact investing conversations went once people started cottoning on to that. By 2010 in San Francisco, there was the Social Enterprise World Forum, and there was the whole debate about whether you should use SROI or social return on investment or RBA, results-based accounting, to start measuring. And it was like, it was kind of like, are we losing the plot here? We're so busy trying to, and then there was a whole day on the contribution method versus the attribution method for working out how. So there was all this craziness broke out. Tell us about, in your experience as a pioneer in that area, where did it go for a while? And maybe it's even still there.
Well, I think one of the big things that happened is what we call ESG, the environmental, social, and governance filters that are typically for publicly traded stocks. And when ESG became a thing that investors were looking at, I think it did a lot of harm to impact investing because people thought, oh, I'm using ESG, therefore I am an impact investor. And what's important to understand is that ESG is a filter for your stock selections that helps you make a better decision for your investment to have higher return. And so it is proven that if you have a diverse board, you will outperform. And you're not doing it because you care about women and minorities. It's because you will outperform. And not that people don't care about the environment and all that, but ESG in its purest form is making sure investment decisions are attributing all of the risks and all of the opportunities that the company is doing that may not show up on the balance sheet. That is not for the good of your heart. It is for the good of your wallet. That's the bottom line. Now, impact investing is about having an impact and having a social or environmental outcome that you want to have happen and making more of it happen because it is fueled by investment dollars rather than philanthropy. It is about doing good first and how you're going to scale that and do more good. Those are two very, very different things. And I think one of the problems is people think that ESG is impact investing, and it's just not. Now, obviously, it is creating positive motivations because companies know that folks are looking at ESG factors, and therefore they would be smart to employ ESG factors. But it's not impact investing in its true sense.
And the emergence then through that period as well of the term social enterprise also emerged, and there's lots of debate about, is a social enterprise because it intentionally loses money but it hires people that otherwise couldn't work, or does it make money and then reinvest that money into helping people that couldn't work? And there was even some confusion around social enterprise. I'd love to hear what's your definition of social enterprise in that space?
Well, first of all, let's start with this. Every company and every investment has an impact.
Mm-hmm.
They have multiple layers of impact. All investing is impact investing, and all companies are impact companies. If your impact is simply, and I think of impact as a sort of a bullseye. If you hire anybody, that's impact. That is economic prosperity, right? Does not make you an impact company, but every company out there who has any employee is helping with economic prosperity, right? And so then what is a social enterprise? What it means is then, is your product or service something worthy and that is beneficial? And I think we could probably talk ourselves into believing any company out there has a beneficial property, right? A cell phone, it's a social enterprise because it's helping people communicate, which helps economic prosperity. And cell phone companies are not typically what we would think of as a social enterprise, but they certainly could make that case, right? And so it's such an arbitrary thing. Yeah. Now, the one that isn't arbitrary is what they call B corporations, benefit corporations. And that's one that I do kind of subscribe to, which is that, and mostly it's because formally, and especially in big companies, they are required to invest and to run the business for the fiduciary responsibility of the shareholders. And so they don't have the luxury to do the right thing unless it is the right thing for their investors. And to change your charter of your bylaws to say that we are about maximizing stakeholder value rather than shareholder value gives us permission to make decisions that might not directly impact the bottom line, or at least in the short term. And I think that is that's all companies. It's not just if you're a social enterprise. All companies have the opportunity to be working towards the benefit of stakeholders. And I would argue that also means bottom line in the longer run. But it's an important distinction because a lot of the big investments, the pension funds and so forth, won't invest unless you are very specifically only about shareholder value. And so legitimizing that as a model, I think, makes a lot of sense. When we talk about impact measurement, when we were doing our microfinance stuff, my impact measurement system was pretty straightforward. When we made the loan, did they have a solid floor or was it dirt? And were there kids in school? And if so, were there girls in school? That was the measure. So it's not like, we'd always ask how many people crossed above the poverty line, as if the poverty line was this line in the sand and there's a ceremonial march. They don't know. They're trading rice for milk, who's counting? But if you can afford to have a solid floor and if your girls are in school, you are no longer in poverty. And it's that simple. And so we would measure that before and after. And metric worked for me. You couldn't put it on some formal, audit, but it certainly worked for our investors.
Yeah. It's fascinating for our listeners. When Elizabeth talked about B Corps, we had Steve Mabbs as one of our guests, runs a technology consulting firm called Edginton, and they went through the process of becoming a B Corp, which, as Elizabeth just explained, is a conscious decision to do something, but it's also a conscious decision that you're not going to go down a certain path as well, because there are investors and a path you're not going to go down when you choose that. So it's a B corporation. I think when people see a B corporation, it's worth knowing that that's a conscious choice to go down a path and also to not go down a path. Thank you for raising that.
It's a big time investment. Sorry.
No, go.
It's a big investment of time and it's a major decision. And it is primarily a decision that is most relevant for public companies. But the exercise of doing the analysis is free to anybody. And I encourage companies to go up and to the B Corp website and pull down the metrics and at least do your own self-reflection. Are we recycling or are we, and that doesn't mean that you need to necessarily change your bylaws, because if you're privately held, it's up to you to decide whether it's okay to make an investment that might not be, immediate shareholder return. It's only when you're really public that it matters a lot. But the exercise of looking at those factors, even if you're not actually filling out forms and auditing and sending it in to get a certification, is really worthy.
Mm. Do you mind if we stay with impact measures for a moment? And because it was beautiful, the way Elizabeth described an impact measurement that was actually meaningful, which was, do you have a hard floor, a dirt floor, and a girls in education? Because that's a perfect example of what's called a contribution model. We don't need to go further than that, because we don't need to measure the effectiveness of the 100 tools in my bag. I only need to know that those two tools made the biggest difference in that setting. And that's a really great example that Elizabeth gave of a contribution model. And what's been interesting is when government gets involved in this conversation about impact investing, and particularly Treasury gets involved, it perverts into a thing called the attribution model, because they want to know can you prove that exact thing at that exact moment wasn't going to happen anyway, you go down this rabbit hole of people actually now starting, it's almost perverse where, and there was a Harvard article written on this about where people start inventing perverse measures just to answer impact investment questions but those at the ground level just go, that doesn't really count. We just wrote that for them. The impact measures are girls in education and the hard floor. Have you seen examples where, and is that happening in the States, or is that a peculiarly Australian version? Because our Treasury's got really, and still, it's really blocked impact investment a great deal in Australia, particularly around social impact investment, because of that sort of crazy nonsense about measuring.
That sounds like more ESG related, because impact investing, which is primarily private investments generally, so you're buying equity in a company. The Treasury is not really involved in whether it's impact or not. That's at the discretion. That's between the CEO and the company itself and its investor, and it's not regulated in that sense. It is in public companies when you're required to report, and particularly more in Europe now, where your ESG factors are required. You're required to track it and report it. But again, I'll reiterate, I don't consider ESG impact investing. It's smart investing in terms of making better informed decisions to outperform if you didn't.
I was wanting to jump, like obviously impact is such a big part and passion of you and what you're doing. Is this something, you've been on multiple boards and you sit on multiple boards, and would love to know, like, is this a subject that you're constantly, talking with the board and making sure that the company is, measuring the right impact in the way that, you believe in? Is that?
You know what? You're going to laugh. I'm not on any boards that aren't impact. I actually never, actually, that's not true. When I was the CEO of CML Global, it was not an impact. So my board positions are either nonprofits or my portfolio companies from my impact investment fund. So after my microfinance days, I was asked if I could do Dignity Fund 2 and Dignity Fund 3. And I said, absolutely not. I'm going to help the big guys do it. Deutsche Bank did a big fund. Other people can do it. It's not a value add. I want to be what we call additionality, doing something additional that wouldn't have happened anyway. And so I ended up doing a number of equity investment funds that invested in equity and social enterprises that had primarily poverty alleviation, like my hot chili pepper company. So I'm on those boards. But I have never been on a board that wasn't about impact, ironically. So I've never had to bring it to the attention and keeping it top of mind.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the boards that you have, the most interesting boards that you've been on?
Well, where I met your dad, YPO.
YPO days.
I was the board of the International Young Presidents Organization. I love my hot chili pepper company. It's a female CEO in Ecuador. You don't see that very often, just saying. And she has, thousands of farmers that they grow these little seedlings and they do hot chilies, like specialties, scorpion and weary and all these things, and sell them to Tabasco. And, but I love it because she's, in those countries, there's not a professional entrepreneurial ecosystem. I mean, she was doing her, I told her she needed to send, newsletters out to her, her base and grow her base. And she was writing a Word document, attaching it and emailing them one by one. I'm like, okay, we're going to get you a CRM. And so I just love being able to especially where there isn't an ecosystem of venture capitalists and other people to learn from. So that's one of my favorite boards. And then there have been some that have been not as favorite. Millie, I think this is when you and I were getting to know each other, the chairman of the board of an organization called Unitas, which was a nonprofit that was helping microfinance organizations scale and hopefully getting to be where they could take for-profit dollars. And so I had my Dignity Fund that was taking investment dollars and then running a nonprofit that was helping scale. And we had a hostile takeover. I don't know if there's such a thing, but there is. I was the female only non-Mormon on the board. It was a Microsoft executive who had started this, and he was Mormon, and he had been called away to be on a mission, and he wasn't allowed to have his ongoing commitments of boards and so forth. And so he asked me to step in as chair. And I don't know. I mean, I hate to kind of say it, but the men thought maybe this was an opportunity to take the money that had been donated and and invest it, but different purposes than had been originally intended. And I don't know, like, it's kind of one of those things I look back and so they it's a longer story than I should probably do recorded, but we ended up shutting down. They voted to shut down Unitas and take all the philanthropy dollars that were there and put it towards an investment model. And I was the chairman at the time and oversaw literally a hostile takeover of a nonprofit. I didn't know it was possible, but I resigned as soon as it started. I resigned like on the spot in that meeting, and so. The decision goes down in record as having been a unanimous decision of the board, but it was because I went on the board for 3 minutes. Anyway, that one's probably my craziest board story.
Oh, wow.
So interesting that you've talked about that was a hostile takeover. One of the things that, and you also talked about additionality, so not doing what other people can do. It's interesting in the not-for-profit space, though, isn't it, that it's very hard for boards of non-profits to see their way to merging with other non-profits who do the same thing or what ostensibly looks like the same thing, but each board has a story about why their version of it is special. So they stay apart and you get this proliferation of well-intended but often uncoordinated efforts in cities around issues, whether it's homelessness, whether it's any range of issues. Through your impact fund or through your experience on boards, have you managed to crack that or create a value proposition that does encourage non-profits to merge together or work better together around issues?
Yes, I have. And I'll give you two stories. One is when I was the chair of Unitas, there were other organizations out there were also about scaling microfinance. One of them was Women's World Banking. One of them was Finca. There were several of them. And the CEO of one of the competitors came to San Francisco, and I hosted an 80-person sit-down dinner in my home for her to fundraise. And people were like, what are you doing? She's your competitor. She's not my competitor. There's no such thing as competitors in nonprofit work, right? And I remember thinking, that sounds so, trite, but it was really a shock to me that people even thought of themselves as competitors. Yeah. I mean, it never really crossed my mind. And so that has kind of stuck with me, which is that we might be competing for dollars, but we're all allies. And really whose dollar and who gets to do that work should absolutely be irrelevant. And so one of the great examples that I like to point to is in homelessness, which is what I'm work is now, is there's an organization down in Texas where they took one location and they told 124 nonprofits, if you're going to do your work, you got to come to the site so that the homeless people don't have to go try to find you. And you are going to specialize. You guys are good at pregnant mothers. You guys are good at this. You're not going to overlap supportive, what your areas of expertise are. And if you're not going to play ball, you don't get funding. This was the government saying, we are going to do this and you are going to collaborate and specialize. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I mean, it works so, obviously there's, strife of whose territory, just like there would be inside of an internal company, power struggles and all the rest. But in general, the model and the hypothesis is brilliant.
Is that similar to what were Tides Foundation on the Presidio trying to do something similar where they were offering to do the back end so non-profits could
fiscal sponsorship?
Yeah, so they could focus on what they were doing and not focus on all of the back end stuff?
That's different.
Yeah.
So fiscal sponsorship is when somebody's doing a nonprofit and they don't want to go through the whole exercise to be a 501c3, which is the U.S. version for a charitable organization, then you can hire somebody to do your paperwork basically and be your back end and to validate that your work is. And with small nonprofits, it just makes a lot of sense to not spend their money on that. But even as you get bigger, it's like outsourcing your accounting, right? Rather than doing your own. And so that, but I don't think that it's not parallel to what you're talking about specializing. It's more like just not being involved in the back end, but they don't help set the mission or do any of the fundraising or do any of the operational things.
Yeah. So you went from moved. I'll leave you to decide how you describe it, but microfinance into homelessness, and boy, this is something that's easy to say, and but it's a massive thing, and in San Francisco, you can't not notice how prevalent this and big it's got, not just in the Bay Area, but in all the surrounds as well. It's quite a remarkable thing. When did you get into this space?
So there was kind of a step in between, which we've talked about a little bit, but after my microfinance days, I was running impact investment funds. So it was sort of like venture capitalists, but for businesses that were all global. In fact, my mother, who's very patriotic, always got mad. And she's like, why are you helping everybody else's poor? Right? and the reason is because we don't have extreme poverty in the United States. We don't have extreme poverty by UN definitions in this hemisphere. And so I'm not, as patriotic about borders. I want to help people who are poor and suffering wherever they are. But that tended to mean that it wasn't in the United States. And I was on my third fund, ready to start our third fund with the same team, Latin America. We were investing in low-income housing, sustainable agriculture, rural. And I get bored. I remember thinking, like, we're going to raise fund 3. We're doing the same thing again. It's a little bit of this same thing we talked about at the beginning. And I didn't know how to tell my partners, like, no, I'm bored, right? And so, but the pandemic hit and nobody was raising money anywhere, particularly global at the moment. And so we decided we'd pause, right? And it was really just pause. But because I thought it was pause, I wasn't job hunting. I wasn't thinking about what I was going to do next. And it gave me this moment to just be curious. And it came again through Young Presidents Organization, YPO. We had a conference scheduled on homelessness that was going to be a program for a weekend in LA for May 2020, and it was canceled because of the pandemic. And somebody had the great idea to send out an email to all the registrants that said, does anybody want to form what we call an action forum? So it's a forum that comes together, but instead of helping each other with our business issues, we think about how we could impact a cause. There were action forums on, orphans and action forums on elephants and whatever. And so we created an action forum just to learn about homelessness. No intention to do anything other than learn. And it was before anybody had Zoom fatigue. We all thought this was kind of a 2-week period of lockdown, and why not use it to learn? And so we started just brainstorming. I think the beautiful part about it was none of us knew anything about the subject. And so we could come in really with a curious learner's mind. And all I knew is that whatever we're doing is not working. We are spending more and more money, and the problem keeps getting worse. In corporate America, we would call that a turnaround crisis, right? We would come in and we would make hard decisions, lay off people, shut down factory lines, streamline to save the business. Like, are people thinking about this problem that way? Because it looks like a turnaround to me, right? Yeah. And so coming in and just looking at it, quite frankly, from kind of a crass business mind and looking at a situation analysis, much like a management consultant would, I had to tell you, it was this aha moment. And I thought, I'll never forget sitting on my sofa going, oh man, I'm going to have to do this. And it could have been puppies. I mean, to be honest, it's more the way my brain works, which is like, oh my God, there's an obvious, I don't want to say I was brilliant and the other people aren't, but there was something that we together, the YPO group, looked at it and thought, wait a minute, there's a few dials you could switch here and a lot of things would change. So it was kind of a few aha moments that I thought, I'm going to have to do this. And I didn't intend initially to run it. I intended to be executive chairman of the board, and I hired a CEO, and I was going to go back to that tech job that I kept thinking I was going to get back after I left Yahoo. But I just so quickly became so smitten with it. And the more I realized how the powers that be and in the homelessness system were just fiercely opposed to what we were doing. And I got to tell you, that's what gets me turned on. I thought, that's how I know we're doing something right. The current system is not working.
Can I you said something and I don't want to skate over it. There was a mind shift for you, or there was almost a dissonance for you there of, I'm getting swept up in this thing that I'm passionate about and this cause, but my mind is still in this corporate tech job here. was there a moment where does that still live in your mind, that dissonance, or have you left it behind now?
Absolutely. And I've not really ever been a materialistic person, but I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, I would love to have a yacht. I love being on the water. I would love to be traveling around first class. I mean, it's that stage of my life. And I could make a lot more money going back to Silicon Valley or in a big corporate job at this stage in my life. And I had a lot of angst about it. I thought a lot about it. And I talked with my YPO forum about it at length. And it came down to this, which gives me the most pleasure. Yeah. It's not about obligation. It's not about, I want to give back to the world. Selfish. Yeah. What do I get the most pleasure out of? Being on a boat? If that is the answer, that's fair. Be honest with yourself. You don't have to tell anybody, right? Yeah. But what gives me the most pleasure? And I have to say right now, making this impact is selfish indulgence. It is pleasure. If it's not, I will not have the obligation to do it.
Your frankness is so refreshing. I love it. I was fortunate in 2019, just before COVID, to have been national finalist in the EY Entrepreneur of the Year, and they had this category, the social category. And I remember coming away from you go through these panel interviews and all of the things, and I can remember having my panel interview and ringing my wife and saying, I'm not going to win the national one. And she was like, why? What did you do? And I said, well, they said it must feel good. They were speaking to me, social entrepreneurship and all these things, and they were saying it must feel good to do that. And I just was like, that's not what I do this for. And so I said, if I was Paul Edginton Proprietary Limited and I built an organisation in Adelaide that had 72 locations nationally and employed nearly 700 people and had the balance sheet that we've grown and all that sort of stuff, you'd be going, go, you legend. I said, but because of my tax status, you just patted me on the head. Like, forget that. I said, we're bigger than many organisations that are here that you're going to give corporate awards for, but you're patting me on the head with a caveat that says it's social. And I thought, so I was really cross about it, going like, if you're giving me the second grade prize because you think somehow what I've achieved with this organisation is somehow second grade, you can keep it. Because there are not-for-profit leaders who would be like you, who can be successful in any field. However, you choose to do it in a harder one with one hand tied behind your back. You can't raise debt equity easily. You can't make mistakes with marketing. Your risk profile, acceptance by the community is different. If you don't deliver, if you're running a corporate entity and you make a loss, that's pretty bad. But if you make a profit and you rip people off, they kind of justify it. You do that in not-for-profit land and you're dead. Like, it's just over. So I'm really, I think you just sort of breezed over sort of this dissonance around I could be making money, lots of money somewhere else. And I just wanted to pick that up and go, I mean, you're somebody who's a great example of, yes, I could be making money and being grand, doing lots of different things, and I choose this.
But I'll be honest, it still nags at me. Yeah. I mean, I'm not as fiercely determined I'm going to change the world and I don't care about money. If I'm honest with myself, of course I do. Yeah. And it is a trade-off, and I have angst. And I think I would also have angst if I was sitting on a boat waddling away my day, thinking I could be doing something more impactful. I think it's a choice, and I feel, I've made the choice very consciously, but it's not slam dunk. I mean, there's regret isn't the right word. There is, I'm looking for the word, but opportunity cost for sure.
Elizabeth, we would love to jump into Dignity Moves. So tell us about your company now. How did you get, we know obviously hearing about your passion. I think we've got a bit of a a good idea of how you got into it. But tell us about, the start of it, what you're doing now. And I know you've got some exciting projects that you're going to be announcing soon. So let's get into it.
So Dignity Moves is specifically about unsheltered homelessness. I don't think people realize that unsheltered is just one portion of a much bigger problem that is a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. And across our country and across the world, people who are experiencing homelessness are generally sheltered. In California, half of the nation's unsheltered live on our streets. Half are all here. It's a uniquely California and West Coast problem. Because on the East Coast, because of the climate realities, cities have enough shelter beds for people, albeit there may not be a place you'd be willing to spend a night, but they do have them. And on the West Coast, instead, we've decided in our infinite wisdom that we're going to spend all of our money on building permanent housing for people. Because to be fair, only permanent housing ends homelessness. Getting somebody in off of the street into something temporary, they're still homeless. So it's considered squandered resources. And yet, as we looked at this from a business model perspective, the cost of leaving people on the streets, just hard costs, is twice the cost per person per year. About $80,000 a year in emergency room visits and encampment sweeps and all that. And about $40,000 a year to bring them indoors, have 24/7 staff and care, and help get them back on their feet. Well, I don't have to have a calculator to tell you that that's squandered resources, right? And yet, it's the wrong pocket problem because that $80,000 is paid for by public works and the psychiatric system. But if you bring them indoors, it's coming out of one pocket, which is the homelessness department. And they are scored on ending homelessness, which is permanent housing. And so this doesn't even help their score, right? In fact, worse, it detracts because it's using the resources they could use. In that simplest framing, if you look at that, you've named a problem, you're halfway to solving it. Right? It's really that simple, is to say, well, then we've got a wrong pocket problem and we've got wrong metrics. Our metrics should be how many nights per year are spent sleeping on the streets. And that accounts for the number of people and the duration. And whoever is bearing the cost of that should be paying to solve it. Now we've got a model. And so we started looking at it and really just the can-do attitude of why aren't we getting people indoors? Well, we've talked about metrics and money. What else? Well, land is expensive. Okay, great. We'll set these up on borrowed land. There's plenty of land out there. It's just not for sale because somebody's got to plan for it someday. Let's do relocatable cabins. Well, people don't want to go to a group shelter because they don't want to be on a bunk bed next to strangers. Great. They get their own room. Give me another one. Building codes are super onerous. Well, this is a crisis. We can use FEMA's codes. The emergency codes as if there was a hurricane. We can, right? Okay. Now all of a sudden we've got lower building codes. The neighbors don't want a shelter in their neighborhood. Okay, let's harness that self-interest. How about the people sleeping on the streets in that neighborhood are the ones that get to come and nobody else? Now that neighborhood sees a visible difference on their streets. Give me another one. Because no is not, it can't be done is not one of the answers, right? Of course it can be done. We've sent men to the moon. We've decoded the human genome. Don't tell me we can't get a roof over a head. We're standing in our own way, and we just got to start looking at those hurdles and knocking them down. And so as you can probably tell, I spent a lot of time preaching. I should have been a preacher. I spent a lot of time educating people on the fact that the system actually we could end unsheltered homelessness by December. It is a policy choice. It is the stroke of a pen or two. We are choosing not to, and for the wrong reasons. And it's costing us more. And that's just dollars. That's not the human suffering and the moral self-worth of ourselves as citizens. I mean, I think the biggest thing standing in the way is people just don't think it's possible. And so therefore it becomes a poison that we start letting fester. It's not possible to solve. Oh, well, people want to be on the streets. They deserve it. There's nothing I can do. We just tell ourselves lies to the point that we walk by people on the streets and we just don't even notice. Like it's just, and I had to tell you, you think about slavery and the Holocaust and genocide and all the horrible things that have happened. Like, I hope our grandkids look at us and they're like, people slept where? Why? We just become immune to it. And yet, if you'd spoken up during the Holocaust or genocide, you probably would have gotten fired or gotten fired at, gotten executed. We had no excuse here. Mm-hmm. And it's not that hard. And so we are, we serve as sort of a developer. We're a nonprofit and we go help find the vacant land, to go help find the funding to build these. We build little tiny homes is what they call them, 64 square feet or 85. We don't make the modular product we buy from off the shelf. There are lots of these companies that you can even buy a tiny home on Amazon these days. I mean, those are easy to find. But we pull it all together and then we work with a supportive services agency that's an expert, local, wherever we are, to help with case management and help get people acclimated back into society and getting them back on their feet, or if they're not going to be able to be back on their feet, get them transferred somewhere where they can be stably cared for elsewhere. And we built our first couple projects literally in San Francisco, our first one. It was such a classic example of pushing water uphill. So we did it fully philanthropically. The city was flat out opposed. They said any money we spend on anything that's not permanent is a waste of resources. And I said, well, we're going to raise it philanthropically. And she said, anytime my staff spends talking to you is a waste of resources. I said, okay, well then don't talk to us. So that's how deeply ingrained this thinking is. And so we did it anyway. And she was still opposed. I said, what's the problem? She said, you're going to walk everybody through it and they're going to love it. And they're going to make me do more of these.
Huh.
That is
Unbelievable.
actually an accusation I will take.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what's the problem? She said, because I don't have enough money to meet my goals as it is. Like, I got to go build a bunch of these little tiny cabin things. They don't solve my problem. And fair. She's not a bad person. She's right. Then her metrics are wrong. And so we did it to her anyway. And I remember when the city, everybody walked through, the mayor and all, everybody was so proud of this thing that they had done. They don't really realize they'd actually opposed it. And she was right. Her worst nightmare happened. And the city decided they were going to do another one down in another district. One of the supervisors walked through and said, this is the best thing our city's ever done. I want one in my district. And we were thinking, the city didn't do it, but that's okay. And they did the community meeting to announce it in a packed room. And this woman got up on the stage and she looked down at me with this look like, I told you this would happen. I mean, it was kind of, it caught on. And now the city, it's the core of their strategy. And so there is sort of a demonstration effects thing. And and then our second community was in Santa Barbara, where we built literally downtown in the heart of the historic Santa Barbara, next to Morgan Stanley's private client services. Talk about likely to get pushback. But it was so beautiful and so well received that because the people sleeping in the alley next to Morgan Stanley were the first ones to get invited in. And the people in the park next door were the next ones. So that neighborhood saw the benefit. And all of a sudden, all the supervisors started calling, going, I want one. I want one in my district. I want one in my district. And so we decided we would do something really innovative where we said, we're just going to do the whole county at once. How many does the whole county need to end this problem completely, have enough places for everybody who needs it, and we're going to do one initiative. Mm-hmm. And that way, no supervisor gets blamed, nobody gets points, no neighborhood can say not in my backyard because it's in everybody's backyard. We're just going to do this. And philanthropy, where people have been what they call donor fatigue. They get tired of donating to things and not seeing the impact. Donor fatigue woke off, man. If you're going to really end this problem in the county, all of a sudden, you start seeing donors coming back out and community partners wanting to be a part of it. And it's just been really exciting. And so we are building in Santa Barbara. We built our first one in Santa Barbara, and now we've got 3 others open, more coming. And it's kind of starting to take off. So we've got projects now in Alameda and Rohnert Park and Watsonville, San Luis Obispo, Oakland, San Bernardino. What have I missed? Thousand Oaks, 3 in San Jose. It's kind of growing like wildfire. It's really fun.
That's because of your, can-do attitude, and you were not going to take no for an answer. You're going to do it. You're just going to do it anyway. You're going to fix this anyway. Yeah.
And thank goodness. Thank you for making that choice because it's just, I think, listening to you, that from a global movement point of view, that approach, the things that you talked about, the NIMBY or the not in my backyard folk who don't want it, is a real problem. And for powerful bureaucrats who are not bad people, but where they can see that their power base and their future is fundamentally shifted, like you're going to change the way I do my work. All those things are real barriers. They're not intended to be real barriers, but they are the real barriers, aren't they?
Well, but think about it for a minute. Let's go back to your comment about self-interest. That's the horse we want to bet on, right?
Yeah.
And so NIMBYs are not bad people. They care about the cleanliness and safetiness of their neighborhood. So do I. Okay? And so what is going to be the better solution? To have those people hungry, unfed, disgruntled, unshowered, off of their meds and pissed off? Or for those same people to be behind a beautiful wall 24/7 staffing, having slept 8 hours a night, taking their medication and getting some counseling. There's not a third choice. They don't vaporize. You cannot bury them. They are human beings. And those are the two choices. Which is safer?
Yeah.
When you frame it that way, it takes a pretty illogical NIMBY to stand their ground, right? And if you can, but it takes credibility, which is to say it will be run safely. And we will invite in the people in the immediate area. And once we've done that, it is going to be a no camping zone. I mean it. Somebody starts putting up a tent, 2 hours, man, I want them out of here because we're going to fold up our end of the bargain. And if you can do that, then the next district and the next district start calling saying, I want one too. But it's a real exercise in credibility. And quite frankly, a lot of governments don't have it because they built these shelters and then the neighborhood gets worse. And so of course they can't, of course they get their voters pushing back, but it's the right thing to do. And it's not that impossible to get voters to understand that.
Can I share a story of the most powerful NIMBY buster that we experienced? We built housing for young people to live in. We said in here that if a young person falls into homelessness, they can't get out. They can't afford the rent. If they can afford the rent, the landlord won't pick them. There was just so many challenges. So we built small housing, groups of housing units called hyper housing. Hyper was an acronym for helping young people achieve. And we built these and we built them as like premium units. And so when we'd have visitors come, they'd go, man, this is better than anything I lived in when I was a young person. And we're like, what do you think they should be grateful for scraps? Like we want them to be aspirational. We want them to live in a house like this. And so they'll have to get a job. So if we have them living like this for 2 years, they'll get used to it. Anyway, we wanted to build these in suburbs. And in one suburb, we turned out the largest public meeting that they'd had, all wearing these stickers saying no hyper housing in our area. What they didn't know is we'd already built one. And people got up and they told horror stories about how young people would sell drugs and there'd be all these terrible things. And the most powerful advocate for us wasn't me preaching and all. It was an old lady stood up in the council meeting. She was terrified and these people were angry and she was terrified. She said, you know, I live next door to hyper housing and thank goodness for that because I'm scared to walk to the bus stop. So I wait for one of the hyper housing kids to walk me to the bus stop. And it's like, hang on a minute. All these people told horror stories about how our hyper housing kids were going to mug her and she was a risk. And she just got up and said, no, I wait for them to walk me to the bus stop because all the other kids know who those kids are and they know that if they're walking me to the bus stop, then I'm going to be safe. And it was like, oh my goodness, and it just all melted away, like, except for there are people that are rusted on. They just haters that can't concede it. But she was our most powerful. She just broke, and we started building more and more houses because of her. Because it was that, you know, she was amazing. But what you do and the resistance you stand in front of, Elizabeth, is just extraordinary. Thank you so much for the work you do. It's amazing.
Thank you for saying that. And, you know, I think the important thing is to say that, you know, I've been warned, it sometimes sounds a little arrogant. It's like, oh, everybody was doing it wrong. And all of a sudden YPO business people showed up and we know better than anybody. I want to be really clear about that. It's not there have been really smart people who've been working really hard and they care a lot. It's not that we care more or work harder or smarter. It's the system the system was designed for a different era and a different set of problems. And we're still stuck in that system. And it took an outsider organization that hadn't been in that system so long that they didn't recognize it. It's the frog in the water, right? And so, you know, I think that's probably the biggest lesson of all of this, which is that sometimes coming in fresh and be courageous enough to say, well, I don't care if that's how you've done it. Like, it makes sense. Let's do it differently. And without being disrespectful, and learn and build from what everybody else has done, but not be indoctrinated into it. Keep the fresh thinking. And there's value to the decades of experience people have brought, and there's value to somebody coming in, and not me personally, but, you know, minds coming in with a fresh look. And, I think an important part of that is when we first started this, before we started it, when we were still in this action forum, we did, we met every week, and then we would assign each other, or go research this, go research that, and come back. I think I was the only one who did my calls. And over the 6 months, I did 350 30-minute Zoom calls. I logged them. 350. People didn't have Zoom fatigue yet, just to learn. And I wasn't trying to start a nonprofit. It was just indulging in the curiosity. And I, humility aside, I'll say I think I probably know more about this problem than anybody, because I bothered to do that. And I learned about it from all different angles and all different, and I think we'd always challenge ourselves to whatever world we're in. If we're not changing jobs every 2 years, to at least find a mechanism for a fresh look at what you're doing, because that's where there's a lot of value that gets lost if we all stay plodding in the same path.
Let's use that as our close, because that. I mean, it's just, I could talk to you for hours, Elizabeth, about so many things, particularly around the system, the system being broken. We've got ministers here getting up in areas of child protection and homelessness saying our system is broken, and yet doing nothing to change the system. Exactly. And the incredible thing there is in broken systems, you get a lot of people who are smart people, who are really good people, but the only muscle they've got is problem solving. So the system's broken, I problem solve. And you go, and what Elizabeth is talking about is saying, she came in and she said, let's try solution creation. Let's stop trying to fix the problem, fix the system, and just concede it's a write-off. Let's do it. Let's create a new way of working. There will be elements within that system we can bring back in, but taking a deficit approach has failed. So what if we take an appreciative approach and learn from there? It's just extraordinary. But it's amazing how solution creation versus problem solving, the way I've likened it is, if you're right-handed and you throw a ball right-handed, that's your problem-solving muscle. If you try and pick up a ball left-handed and throw it, and you're like, you don't throw it very hard and it feels really awkward and whatever, that's your solution creation, but it's not very good. So you go back to thinking that your exercise is ball throwing. It's like, it's not though. If you keep practicing with your wrong hand, eventually you get just as good. And now you become ambidextrous, and now you can do more than ball throwing. You can do all sorts of things. But we just don't do left hand throwing very much.
I love that. I wrote that down. I think that's a brilliant framing.
Yeah, thank you. The last question, similar to the first one, we ask everybody as a bookend. So, and particularly there must be days when you've driven home going, oh my, I can't be serious. But a song comes on the radio that just, even though you're mad and you just, you want to be mad, and a song comes on and it makes you smile. What is that? What's that song?
Oh my goodness. That's an oldie, probably.
Yeah.
Like a good Neil Diamond or something like that. Something I can sing to and it's fun. Yeah.
Is there one in particular that comes to mind?
No, I don't know. Sweet Caroline. My daughter's Caroline.
Yeah,
there you go.
Beautiful Caroline.
Beautiful.
That's a trite one everybody does. But yes, Millie. There's my daughter who's now off at Vanderbilt. Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being part of the CEO Advantage podcast. You've just been amazing. And I would...
Thank you.
I think what you're doing is so important and so inspiring. So thank you so much for the work you do.
Well, when you're here in San Francisco next, let me know.
I will definitely do that. We're coming to the States next year. So we will definitely come and see you.
Love that. I would love that. And Millie, you too, girl.
Yeah, definitely due to come back. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
And
You're
you're a very important person in my life. So it's a privilege to have you on the show to share your incredible journey.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks. We'll catch up soon. Nice to see you.
See you, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.